Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us live for today's webinar. My name is Mathilde, and I'm the Manager of Marketing here at Amity. Amity provides customer success managers with the platform that they need to retain and grow their customers at scale. And we're really excited for today's webinar as we are joined by our really good friends from the Success League. Our presenter for today is Kristen Heyer. She's the founder and CEO of the Success League, which is a consulting firm that helps organizations with customer success operations. Kristen helps her clients develop metrics and goals, assess customer touchpoints, select technology, and design playbooks, amongst other things. And she's very knowledgeable about customer success. And we've actually hosted a number of webinars with Kristen in the past. We've covered topics like one-to-many engagements, leadership skills, compensation plans, and even more. So we already know how knowledgeable she is, and we always get such positive response from the sessions. So we keep on bringing her back for more, and luckily she's always willing to share her wealth of knowledge with us. So we're super excited about today's presentation. Now, I just want to share a few housekeeping notes before we get started with the presentation. So we will record the webinar today, and we will send the recording and the slides to everyone later this week. So keep an eye on your inbox, and you'll get a note from me with a replay link, which you can use and share with your team as well. We do have a Q&A planned at the end of the webinar. So at any point, you can open your Q&A panel in Zoom and send us your questions. Don't wait until the end. Just send them our way whenever, and we'll try to have as much time as possible at the end to answer as many as possible. And as usual, we will be on Twitter, so join us using the hashtag CSWebinar, tag us at GetAmity, and tag us at Kristen Heyer, and we'd love to engage with you. If you like a slide, take a screenshot, share it, tag us, and we'll engage with you. So for anyone joining us for the very first time this week, Amity provides a customer success management software that allows for things like health scoring, tracking engagements, automating emails, analytics, and more. So if you want to learn more, do request a demo online. You should be able to find a direct link in the chat shortly, and you can also let me know, and I will arrange that for you as well. And that's all that you're going to hear about Amity today, because we're super, super excited to be introducing Kristen Heyer. Kristen, thank you so, so much for joining us today. Really excited, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of the Amity webinar series. I'm really excited to talk with all of you guys today about customer success and how to plan for customer success in terms of your team, your headcount, and how to get the right people hired at the right time for the right amount of money and get them onboarded. So that's what we're going to be covering. That is a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to be covering it at a high level today. Before we get started, just a little bit about myself. As Mathilde said, I am the head of the Success League. I'm the founder and CEO. We are a customer success consulting firm, and we work with organizations all over the world. We have a training program, we have a consulting program as well, and would love to work with any of you on either of those things if you're interested after today's session. And I'm going to have a little bit of information. Today, we're going to be covering the overall cost of customer success. I'll be talking about that. We'll talk about segmentation and programs and how you think about what kind of program makes the most sense for your company. From there, we're going to talk about how you calculate headcount, and then the kind of customer success roles that you should be thinking about at different stages of the life of your company. And then we'll also be getting into how do you hire the right person and how do you onboard them effectively. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. If you came to today's session hoping that I would give you the exact number of customers that you should have for your CSMs, you're going to walk away disappointed. I'm just going to say that right up front. I am going to show you how you can calculate that for you, but that is not a number that is consistent from company to company. And so we will get to a way for you to think about that, but I'm not just going to hand that to you. So you'll have to do a little bit of calculation on your own. What you want to be thinking about first is you want to be thinking about the overall cost of customer success. So customer success is usually calculated as the fully loaded cost of everyone in the customer success team, not including support, if support is part of under your customer success team umbrella. So fully loaded means it includes benefits, variable compensation, incremental costs like tools and training and stuff like that. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying cost of customer success. Your HR department, if you have one, can typically help you calculate the fully loaded cost of a specific person or a specific role in your organization. So as you're thinking about, where you are on the scale right now, you want to be thinking about fully loaded employees. So there are a number of industry benchmark reports out there that cover the ratios I'm sharing with you now. If you go online and you look up cost of customer success, you'll find all of those reports. I want to let you know that we have found that those reports are for the most part accurate in terms of the range that they're showing. So from our own experience, we're finding that those benchmark reports that are out there are pretty true. I think there is a lot more variation than is reflected in those benchmark reports though, and it really depends on a lot of different things. So what we are seeing is that early stage companies, these are companies that are maybe in their seed or Series A round of funding, are showing a cost of customer success that is higher. And then growing organizations, companies that are at their scaling phase, are usually in about the 15% cost as a percentage of ARR. And more mature companies are able to get sometimes their customer success team cost down to 10% or even less. I think that if you go less than 10%, you're really running a risk of potentially jacking up your churn or having customers that are out there talking smack about you. So you want to be a little bit careful about that. But you can get your costs lower as you get more efficient and grow. So these are some very broad numbers. Some things that you need to think about for your specific company are that there are things outside of maturity that drive that cost up or down. Implementation process is one. Often early stage companies have been so focused on their core technology that they haven't taken the time to make implementation easy or self-service. And so if that is you or your company, that means that it requires more people and more headcount cost to serve your customers well. So if you have a heavy implementation process or a long implementation process or one that requires a lot of hand-holding, your costs will be a little bit higher. So keep that in mind. Your brand promise weighs into this as well. If you promise a high level of customer service, you need to provide that regardless of the maturity level of your company. Industry. Different fields have customers with different levels of technical expertise. Some require more hand-holding and help than others. So if you're in an industry that requires a little bit more white glove service, just because of the nature of your customers, you may have to have more cost associated with your customer success group. Competitors, if you're in a heavily competitive market, customer success can be a real differentiator for your company. So you might want to think about that. And if it is a differentiator for you, you may want to invest more money in customer success. And then finally, expansion opportunities. If your base has a lot of room for expansion, you can justify a larger customer success team because the increase in expansion revenue offsets the cost of the team. So you want to be thinking about those other considerations aside from maturity. And when you're out there looking at those benchmark reports, just know that those reports are great and they give very broad guidelines, but you need to dial them in for your company. So if you've got a CEO or a CFO that's really encouraging you to match benchmarks, make sure that you've thought about implementation, your brand promise, your industry, your competition, and your expansion opportunities as well, and figure out where that should put you on this scale. I'm going to answer questions about this at the end, and I'm sure there will be a lot, so I'm happy to do that. I want to next move on to thinking about your segmentation and your programs. So we think about this in terms of a number of different criteria. We think about average revenue, we think about customer behavior, and we think about the brand promise again when we're thinking about segmentation. Segmentation really drives the kind of customer success program that you're going to put in place. So I'm going to assume for this purposes of this presentation, because I have to keep it pretty tight, that you guys all know what I mean by high, low, and tech touch programs. But again, I'm happy to answer questions on that at the end. You know, a lot of people think about those things in terms of average recurring revenue, but I think it's important to consider these other two factors as well. Average ARR is it's a good way though of roughly determining what kind of program you can afford. Most organizations beyond the very early stage have multiple segments, so you want to consider each segment that you have. And ARR can be a way for you to segment your base at a high level. Essentially, the way that breaks down is the higher the annual recurring revenue, the higher touch you can afford your program to be. Customer behavior is important to consider as well. So some customers don't want to engage with a CSM. If you have a self-service purchasing process or you have an easy-to-use piece of no-frills technology, a tech touch program might actually perform better for you and be more engaging to your customers. On the other hand, if your customers expect a relationship or if there are large selling opportunities at stake, a higher touch model is probably more appropriate for you. So that's the way to kind of think about customer behavior and how that plays in. And then finally, you want to think about your brand promise. So are you pitching yourselves as a BMW, but you're providing more of a Kia experience to your customers? That's not a very good match. So you want to match your program to the expectations that your sales and your marketing teams have set for your customers. Most of the time, you're going to find that these factors line up. Or you might find that they're just one step removed, like this or like this. If you have extreme differences in these factors though, like a low ARR, but you're positioning your company as a prestige brand, you might need to back up from thinking about your customer success program and really go back to your leadership team and have a conversation at a company level about what is realistic and what is scalable. So if you find that you've got wide variations here, that's actually a sign that there are deeper issues in terms of your business model, and you want to go take a step back and work on that first and then come and think about your customer success model. But let's assume that you've figured out what level of touch makes sense for your company. And from there, we want to talk about how do you calculate your headcount. We recommend that you do this in two ways and that you kind of marry the two calculations together. So you need to come to a number of customers per CSM. That's a critical number for you to figure out for your company by segment so that you can figure out your headcount and do your budgeting for a customer success program. So you have to arrive at it, but again, I'm going to emphasize this throughout the presentation today. There is no magic number. You have to figure out what makes sense for your company and for your program, and this has to be done segment by segment. Many people get really caught up in this top-down analysis portion. So, you know, there's a lot of reports out there that cite specific numbers in terms of how much ARR a single CSM should represent. I'm actually showing one of these here. This is a Gainsight study from the CEO's Guide to 2015 Budget Planning. I think that you can look at those, again, benchmarks and reports that are out in the market, but you really need to dial this in for your company. Unfortunately, CEOs and CFOs tend to really zero in on these reports, and they, of course, like to push toward the higher end of the spectrum because that cuts costs. So they tend to zero in on that $2 million number that you see up there, which is really unfortunate. The reality is that you need to choose a ratio that works for your company. In earlier stage companies where you need to be providing a high level of care to the first few customers, you're going to have a much lower dollar amount associated with each CSM. Likewise, most companies with a low touch model will have a really hard time getting CSMs even up to 1 million without completely overloading them with customers. So you want to be really careful if you're in one of those situations to make sure you're not overwhelming your CSMs with too many clients if you try to shoot for too high of an average ARR. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're a company with large average annual recurring revenue per customer, you're going to find that you blow by that 2 million with just a few customers. And so then you're going to have CSMs who are, kind of underloaded or, don't have enough to do. And it's not efficient. You want to make sure you're trying for the best efficiency on your team. So, if you've got a high ARR average customer, you're going to have CSMs that are up there in the tens of millions of dollars potentially, and that's okay. That works just fine if that's the program that works for you. So you want to be really careful about this top-down analysis. I think it's important to do. It's certainly important to know how much a CSM should represent on average in each of your segments. I think that's important to know, but it's not the only thing that you should do. So what we recommend is that you also do bottom-up analysis. And bottom-up analysis is looking at how much you have those CSMs doing and making sure that maps to that top-down analysis. So what we find is that CSMs can accomplish, on average, about 40 activities a day. That works out to about 5 things an hour in a typical 8-hour day. So that's all emails, calls, meetings, all of the stuff they're doing throughout the day. So obviously, if you have a CSM who's handling a lot of long meetings or is traveling, this number should go way down. If you have a CSM who's tasked with doing a lot of call work or who has a large number of customers, that number might go up a little bit. So you want to really dial in that number for the people on your team and see what's realistic. If you've been collecting data on that, you can go back and you can look at the data for your top performers and see what they're averaging, and you can use that as a benchmark for your group. Think about what you want your customer experience to be and what you want your CSMs to do. So this is where mapping your customer journey and your touch points can be really super helpful. And then once you know what your touch points are for each of your segments, you can figure out how long those things will take and use that to calculate how much time your CSMs will need to spend with each customer each month in order to achieve that customer experience that you're shooting for. And you can then use that to say, okay, if I have a CSM that can accomplish 80 activities a month and it's going to take 10 activities per customer to provide the experience we're looking for, that CSM can have 80 customers. I think I did the math right on that. So anyway, you can just do a math problem and you can figure out how many customers per CSM you can support. So once you've done that top-down and bottom-up analysis, you want to compare those two numbers. And if they match, fantastic. That's a really good number for you to use as you think about budgeting for your customer success headcount. If they don't match at all, you have to make some tough decisions. You either have to think about lowering the expectations in terms of how much revenue a customer success manager represents, or you have to scale back your customer experience and reduce the number of touch points in your customer journey so that you can provide the experience that you can afford. So doing these two calculations and bringing them together helps you arrive at that correct ratio, which then you're going to use to do your budgeting as you go forward. And that allows you to easily calculate, the number of CSMs you need right now and the number that you'll need in the future as you look at, what the expectations are for sales. Once you've figured out what your headcount should look like, you go on to figuring out what roles you need. This is how I like to look at it, and I think this goes back to the level of maturity of your company and your department. If you are a startup or an early stage company, you may just have one CS person. Oftentimes, companies hire the person that they see as their future CS leader, and that's the person who starts running customer success in the organization, and they're doing a wide variety of things. They're figuring out the processes that are going to be best practices for the team. They are looking at how how the customers are behaving. They're actually working with the customers directly. So that person needs to have a lot of skills in a lot of different areas. So if you're hiring for that person, you want to make sure that you get a person who is really strong in a lot of different areas and has maybe worked for a startup before, because those folks have to wear a lot of hats. As you move into the growth stage, you will then start to see specialized roles for things like professional services or implementation or training. A really good rule of thumb when you're considering adding specialists is to look at how many different activities members of your team are doing. What we have found is that a typical role does best with about 40 different job activities. If it's more than 40 different things, it's a really good idea to think about specialized roles at that point. This is also when it sometimes makes sense to think about creating some leadership structure to your team. A good rule of thumb there is 6 direct reports maximum per new manager. So if you're promoting someone into a leadership role and they've never been a people manager before, 3 to 6 is probably a good number of people for them to have. If you are an experienced leader, you can probably handle realistically up to about 12 people before that becomes unsustainable. These are pretty standard rules of thumb in the HR world, so it should be consistent with what your human resources department is telling you, so you can check with them if you have a human resources department. And then as companies mature even more, it starts to make sense to add operations team members. You can see this in the maturity part of this model that I've got here. Luckily, that is becoming a more and more common role in the customer success space. Those are the people that tackle things like systems administration or customer marketing, compensation management. They typically don't become super critical until the annual recurring revenue per CSM ratio increases, which is great because that helps to cover the cost of those supporting players on the team. Finally, one thing I want to mention here is you need to hire ahead of your need. If you've done a good job of figuring out that customer to CSM ratio and that's dialed in really well, you can know based on your sales model and how customers are expected to come in throughout the year, what you're going to need in terms of a CSM and when you want to bring them on board. You need to allow time for those new CSMs to get onboarded before you hand them a bunch of customers. If you do that and you kind of throw them to the wolves, you risk both that new CSM's experience and also the experience of your customers. So make sure you try to hire ahead of need. Now I realize not every company lets you do that, but that's the ideal. You also want to leave a little bit of room in your CSM's customer base that is assigned to them so that you can add new customers over time without overburdening them. So make sure you're getting ahead of the hiring. I know we're kind of coming close to our end here and I only have a few more slides, so we'll try to get through those in the next 5 minutes, and I want to leave some time for questions. So, hiring right. When you are looking for new people, make sure that you're comparing them to a model of your ideal CSM rather than to each other. If you just compare candidates to each other, you run the risk of comparing two not so great candidates to each other and then just picking the one that works the best. You really want to pick the ideal CSM. There's a huge amount of variation in the market in terms of experience and the type of program that your CSM has worked in. So you can't just go by somebody's title in this field right now and assume they're going to be a fit. You need a really thorough hiring process. So we recommend that you first build a model. What you see here on the screen is a model that we use. So we look at 10 key areas of skills, experience, and we determine what is required for a specific role. So you want to make sure that you're using a model that is specific to your program, your team, your company. Don't just copy a job description from someone else. Really think it through and take the time to do that. The time that you invest in putting good models and job descriptions together is going to pay off in the long run by getting you really killer candidates for your role. And it's going to reduce turnover and it's going to reduce poor hires. Once you've built that model, you want to write a job description and responsibilities from that. And you also want to build interview questions that ensure that you have thoroughly explored all of these important skills and characteristics and experiences. You don't just let a candidate tell you that they did executive business reviews or quarterly business reviews. You want to make sure they tell you all about it so that you know they have the depth of experience that you need. So if you do group interviews, you want to make sure you've really prepared everybody on the panel to ask the questions that you want them to ask. And that helps you also compare candidates apples to apples. The last thing I wanted to talk about here was being a little bit careful about interviewing for culture fit. Culture fit is really important, but culture is not whether you want to go get beers with somebody after work. Culture is how well are they going to fit into the way that your company works, and companies work in different ways. So give that some thought. You're not just looking for buddies. It is important to balance culture fit with diversity. Diversity is really important. If you hire a homogenous team, you're going to miss out on a lot of skills and strengths that diverse people will bring to your organization. So, you know, as you're working on culture fit, you want to think about that. You want to think about what that really means and leave enough room in your culture fit questions to allow for people that come from diverse backgrounds to come into your team and bring all those skills and strengths with them. From here, you want to be thinking about how do you onboard those people. So most organizations, unfortunately, take a sink or swim approach to onboarding, which is really not fair to new employees or frankly to the customers that you hand that new CSM to. Onboarding takes time, but you can really help to improve its effectiveness by following a few steps. First of all, you want to consider a broad range of topics and the training resources that you might already have. A lot of organizations have things on the company and things on the product already developed. So check with your HR team or your training team and see what they have done in the past and see if you can leverage any of that. For industry information, you can look at associations in your field for free resources. That's a great source of information. And then, you know, just get creative and think about what you've got and what you need to build. As you do some research around your company and talk to people about what you're trying to build, you'll probably find that there's a lot of stuff that already exists that you can leverage. You want to use agile methodologies to plan your training program. What this means is come up with the modules that you want each new CSM to go through and plan each week of onboarding as a training sprint. What that does is it prevents you from having a CSM just sitting around because there's some HR training class you want them to go through, but it doesn't happen until Wednesday or whatever. So, you know, you can kind of shuffle things around if your system is module and get people through all the things that you want them to go through over time. So make sure that you're thinking about how to make your program agile. It also helps you carve out time for self-directed learning, which is really important. You also want to keep in mind that people learn in different ways and respond well to different kinds of training approaches. So mix things up. You can use online learning, you can use hands-on learning, you can use classroom learning, you can do one-on-ones with people, and all of those things help accommodate different learning styles and will get people up to speed better. And then finally, don't forget that a big part of onboarding is socialization with the rest of the team. Establishing those strong working relationships can be just as important as learning about the product. So don't just focus on the product and have them deep dive on that for a week. Leave time and create ways for your new CSMs to engage with the rest of your group. With that, I want to open it up for questions. Before I do that, I just wanted to call out how you can get in touch with me if you'd like to. You can always just email me directly. I am Kristen at thesuccessleague.io. We have 3 CS leadership training program classes that go much, much deeper on the topics I covered today. One is called Planning a Team Structure, one is called Hiring Top Performers, and one is called Onboarding New CSMs. So if you want to go deeper on anything that we discussed today, check out those classes. You can find them on our website. And then we also do have consulting engagements in all of these areas to help organizations build out their customer success teams. So I think at this point, Mathilde, we're going to open up for questions, correct?
Yes, so we already have a lot of awesome questions.
Okay, great.
So let's get started and start answering them. So
Perfect.
we did have a few questions around the slide that you had about headcount and specifically the idea of activity.
Okay.
So
let me go back to that. This one?
Yeah. No, sorry, actually, that was a different slide. I think the next one, yes, around the concept of activity.
Yes.
So we did have a question, how do you choose the appropriate activity and what is an appropriate activity, and do you base that on, customers or customer activities, things like that?
So when you're thinking about activities for your customer success managers, I like to start with a customer journey. So for a particular segment of customers, you want to think about what are the key touch points to help drive that customer toward achieving the outcomes that they wanted from your solution. So that can include things like you want your CSMs to do a monthly outreach call, or you want your CSMs to do a quarterly business review, or you want your CSMs to respond whenever a customer is not utilizing the solution effectively. Whatever those touch points are, and those are different for every company, you want to define those, and that's where you start. So start from the customer. What do you want the customer experience to be like? And then from there, you can think about, okay, do you have more than 40 items on that list of things that are the touch points? Or are some of those touch points representative of a couple different actions that need to happen? If that's the case, then you probably are at a point where there's a couple of different roles on the team that are going to be required to deliver that customer experience. And 40 is just a general rule of thumb that comes from all of the playbook work that we've done. We find that on average, a playbook that outlines all of the tasks for a particular role is about 40 plays long. So it comes from a lot of the work that we've done. So 40 is not an arbitrary number, but it will vary a little bit from company to company. I think it's a great rule of thumb to use, though. So that's how we arrive at the number of different activities. In terms of breaking out activities between different roles on the team, you really want to think about what makes sense. And there's some kind of industry standards for that. One is that often it makes sense to break apart the onboarding part of bringing a new customer into a company. So if you have an intense implementation process, often it makes sense to have that be a separate role. But you want to draw those lines between roles wherever you think it makes sense in terms of thinking about people's skills that they're bringing to the job. It's really hard to find people who are really good at everything. So, you have to do that when you're in an earlier stage company, but in a later stage company, you have the luxury of being able to hire specialists. So think about that as well. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Building off of that, we actually had a question from Jeff here, who was wondering, do you have a couple of examples of CSM roles and typical specialists that you would start hiring when you can?
Yeah, so that is one example, is the implementation specialist. Typically a CSM for a growing company that maybe has not hit their scaling phase yet includes a lot of things. It includes getting that customer through their implementation. It includes building a relationship with the buyer inside the company. It includes uncovering, at the very least, if not closing, growth opportunities within an account. It includes going through the renewal process with the customer and getting them to renew their agreement for an additional period of time. Over time, where I see those roles breaking apart, I see a lot of people who are choosing that implementation specialist. That's probably the most common thing I see, is having somebody separate to do implementation. Along with that, if there is a lot of sort of secondary users within the customer base, so maybe it's a tool that, let's say, the HR department purchased, but it's actually going to be used by every manager in the company, so there are a lot of users. Often there's a training specialist that is broken out, and that kind of goes alongside with the implementation specialist. So I see that. I see people having renewal specialists. These are sort of like account managers inside the account. And when I see those, it's usually because there's some level of complexity to the contract or the renewal itself. So those are people who just focus on getting those renewals done at the end of the year or at the end of the contract. I see sometimes people who have carved out a professional services role. We do a lot of work with education tech companies, and in those organizations, there's often some level of re-implementation that needs to be done every school year. And so in those organizations, they often have a professional services team that is doing that re-implementation every year. And so those are the main ones that I see. I also see a lot more organizations thinking about customer success operations and how do they make their teams efficient by adding a layer of operations people on top of that. The roles I see there, usually it starts out with a systems specialist who's maybe managing their customer success platform. Or their CRM system. I see then that expanding into things like customer marketing, working on compensation plans, doing analytics for the leader of the team. So those are some ops roles that are pretty common. I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that.
Sure.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Okay.
We're getting a lot of really awesome questions, so I'd like to thank everyone. I think a few people were wondering what the website that you mentioned was, so maybe if you want to go back to that slide so people can go ahead and get in touch with you if we don't get to answer the questions.
Oh, our website?
Yes.
This one. Oh, here.
Yeah.
This is how to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm actually camped out today in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania at Alpha Lab. So if you know Pennsylvania, that's where I am today. And I have some time to answer questions this afternoon. I'm giving a talk at a meetup here tonight.
Awesome. So yeah, if we have anyone there, they should definitely get in touch with you.
Yeah, get in touch with me.
Another great comment and question from Wendy here is, I grew from myself as a CSM to managing a team of 3 in 1 year. And I'm now being asked to provide money return to hire more to my team. I like the metrics to measure how many I need. Aside from upsell, how do you figure out what the other ROI of adding to the team is? And she gave a few examples like references, lifetime value of the customer. Do you have any other ideas?
Yeah, so references are a really good one. To me, that falls in the customer satisfaction bucket of metrics. I think there are really 3 buckets of metrics in general for customer success. There's retention, and that gets measured in a lot of different ways, although churn is sort of the most common thing that shows up on business plans. Then there's expansion. Expansion, it sounds like you've already got that covered, so good for you. So retention, I think if you're trying to justify the cost of your team, you want to be measuring retention in terms of dollars, not number of customers. So that can be a way that you can really clearly represent that not only are you producing expansion revenue, but you're helping your company hang on to revenue. It is 4 times as easy to keep revenue from existing customers as it is to go get a brand new customer. So you want to emphasize that as you're trying to position the value of your team. I think lifetime value is another way to do it, but it's a little more clear cut if you're just really talking about how much revenue are you preserving in any given period. And I have found that boards and senior leaders respond to that very well. So I think you have all of the right things. Satisfaction is the last bucket of metrics. There's a lot of different ways that companies are measuring that. Referrals are one. Companies that are willing to serve as a reference, which is sort of like a referral but not, is another way to measure that. I have some customers that are looking at what percentage of their customer base is willing to be a reference. So that's another way to measure that. I mean, there's, of course, NPS, which I think is a little problematic in a lot of ways, especially in terms of how people implement it, but you can look at that. I think most executives and boards understand NPS pretty well. It's not my favorite, but you have the advantage of people understanding what it is. So I think you're on the right track. You just need to, reflect everything in terms of dollars rather than raw numbers.
Awesome. I'm just going to mention we're also getting a lot of questions around compensation plans, and we actually did a full webinar about compensation plans.
Oh, yes. You might have to dig back a little bit into the Amity archives, but that was the first webinar that we did, was on how to plan variable compensation for your customer success team. So there is an entire I think, almost hour-long webinar dedicated to that. So
Yep.
yes, go check
Yeah,
that one out.
I will actually, I'm going to send the link to everyone in the chat as well,
Oh,
so that if
perfect.
anyone wants to save it, it will probably answer all of your questions around compensation plans.
Yeah.
But it's 39, so let's take one last question and then wrap up.
Perfect.
Thanks everyone so much for all the questions. We did get a question in earlier at the beginning of the webinar, wondering why is it that you shouldn't include the support team in your customer success cost for calculating your ratio?
So that's not generally included in the benchmarks that are out there, which is why I called that out. So if you're online and you're looking at people's articles, they often will specifically call out that they're not including support. The other reason that I wouldn't put that together is because support is a role that is very clearly in the cost of doing business or cost of sales bucket on a budget, whereas customer success can actually be more on the revenue side of the budget. And so because it is a proactive role and it is driving revenue, it's actually more effective for you as a, if you're a customer success leader, to treat those two parts of what is overall customer success in my mind. Treat those two parts separately, because if you can show that your customer success team is helping to drive revenue, that actually can do what the woman who asked a couple of questions ago is after, which is to prove the value of your team and get you more resources for your customer success efforts. Mostly it's just a matter of how things are bucketed from a finance standpoint on the budget, and that has to do with generally accepted principles of accounting. So that's why they usually break that apart in the benchmarks that are out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that, and thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and answering all of our questions today. We didn't get to answer all of them, but I really recommend everyone get in touch with Kristen, connect with her on LinkedIn. She's super knowledgeable, as you can tell. So yeah, Kristen, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. I always love doing these webinars with you. So hopefully we can get a few more on the books. Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
sure. Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending. Have an awesome end of your day. Bye.
Bye, everybody.